Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I'm going to start a new series with this video for the author Thomas M. Disch. And this comes from my interest lately in the new wave, having read a lot of J.G. Ballard and reading the 60th anniversary issue of New Worlds and reading some Michael Moorcock and other authors. And so I want to read more of that period of science fiction, which there's really a lot of that new wave fiction that I haven't read yet. I've read some Thomas M. Disch, but not a lot. Just a handful of short stories, never any of his novels. And Thomas M. Disch just doesn't get talked about much. He's a really amazing writer. He's always been highly regarded in the genre as one of the most literate writers that the genre has had since the 60s. But he just doesn't get that much attention anymore. Maybe because he did die in, how long ago was it? 2008. He passed away. He lived from 1940 to 2008. So he's just not getting attention anymore. And that's sad. He's one of the best writers. I did see a couple other BookTube channels recently did some Thomas M. Disch discussions, and well, I've been wanting to get to it for quite a while now. You know, for the two reasons. Number one, I want to focus a little more attention on Thomas M. Disch publicly. But number two, as I stated, I haven't read a whole lot of his work myself, so I want to learn more about his work. And so I chose to do my deep dive where I go back to the very beginning, try to read everything I can get my hands on in order of publication. And this being his first published story in my bibliography, if my bibliography is accurate, is titled The Double Timer. It was published in the October 1962 issue of Fantastic, which I happen to have that issue. It was published in the October 1962 issue of Fantastic, or it's also known as Fantastic Stories of Imagination at this particular time. It started out just being called Fantastic, and it was kind of the successor to Fantastic Adventures. It's a Ziff Davis magazine, so it's a companion to Amazing Stories. In the early 60s, both magazines were edited by Celie Goldsmith, and she introduced a lot of new wave authors to the magazine, publishing a lot of J.G. Ballard. She published Ursula Le Guin in both Amazing and Fantastic. She published Thomas M. Disch, and the cover of this is for a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story by Fritz Leiber. So this was also a magazine that carried on the legacy of sword and sorcery through the 50s and 60s during a time period when sword and sorcery didn't get a lot of attention. The place where you would find most of the sword and sorcery stories that were being written was Fantastic Stories of Imagination. So a little different from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. Fantasy and science fiction, back then, I feel they had a lot of fantasy content, but I feel like they were heavier on science fiction than fantasy. And the fantasy they published was not the sword and sorcery variety. It's never really been known as a sword and sorcery magazine. But Fantastic was publishing Conan and Grey Mouser, and I think they published some Elric stories. You know, they were the place where sword and sorcery was being kept alive through the 1950s and 1960s. And in the 1960s, the magazine, as I said, under the editorship of Seeley Goldsmith, both amazing stories and fantastic, took a turn towards being a much more literate new wave style magazine at a time when the new wave still wasn't official. But the writers were there and they were getting going at this time, and so 1962, Thomas M. Disch published The Double Timer. Now, The Double Timer is actually more of a science fiction story. Fantastic. Just because it was a fantasy story, that doesn't mean they didn't publish some science fiction too. And this story is a short story, and it's a science fiction story because it's a time travel story. And the basic gist of the story is you have a guy that uses time travel to try to commit the perfect murder. And Disch comes in with a pretty interesting twist on this whole theme. You might think it's a pretty cliche theme, but Disch makes it pretty fresh in this story, I think. It's a time paradox story. It's very well thought out, very well thought through. It's a very intelligent little story. The writing and characterization are excellent. And the story makes you think pretty much everything you can want from this type of story. I feel it does fall short of being great, mainly by nature of being short and being a pretty common theme overall. But I do recommend it. I think you should look up The Double Timer. And this issue of Fantastic is where it was first published. And so I recommend the story. I go out and read it. And after you go out and read it, come on back. Put your comments about the story in the comments section of my video here. I want to hear it. And I want everybody else to be able to learn from your perception of this story, your viewpoint of this story. And come on back. I'm going to do more Thomas M. Disch. Don't know how quickly I'll get to it, because I am, in 2025, I'm choosing to focus a little more on older work, because I'm seeing some connections where I really want to cover some key older authors and books in video reviews before I go on to certain other stories, and so that if you stick with me and watch all these videos, you too will see these connections that I'm starting to see among all these among some of these stories I'm reading. So anyway, the next story that Thomas M. Disch published is titled The Demiurge. I will get to that. I hope you'll come back and join me for that, and the rest of Thomas M. Disch and all the other authors and stories and topics that we cover here in Telltale Books.